We are winding down this study. In fact, next Sunday will be our final study as we look at the second half, beginning verse 10, I think it is, of the book of Ephesians. And just to let you know what we're planning, starting the 19th, we plan to have a leadership class, probably about 3 Sundays, and then we'll transfer back to our study as well. The study in the auditorium will be primarily for the men, but it will deal with different aspects of leadership. So any of you ladies that want to stay out here can do that, or you can go back in the ladies' class. We will not have the young adult class either, hoping that we can have as many of the men and boys out here as we possibly can, as we look particularly at leadership and service and that type of thing. If you got any questions about that, you can talk to one of the elders as we sort of put plans together and try to decide what or what not we're going to do. Getting into our lesson this morning, it's interesting as you look at Ephesians 5, particularly as it closes out, and then gets into chapter 6, that Paul basically covers all of mankind. In the latter part of chapter 5 that we looked at last week, he talks about husbands and wives. As we get into chapter 6, he's going to talk about kids obeying parents. And then he will talk about slaves or servants and masters. So it basically covers all of mankind. And I think that one of the things that sort of jumps out, at least at me, is that God did not plan for us to live in isolation. He did not intend for us to be hermits, or whatever term you might want to use there. Relationships are good. Relationships are important. Relationships are very difficult at times. And, it's the old adage of, if you are not happy with something, I remember the story about a fella, he was unhappy about something, that had taken place that he thought was of a sinful nature. It very well was. So he goes to another congregation, and somebody pointed out to him, he says, if they were perfect, they won't be when you get there. And that's kind of life, isn't it? We have to deal with personalities, we have to deal with situations, and even though we make great efforts to stick with the truth, which we should, and we should constantly be looking at that and dealing with that, you still blend in the personalities and our opinions. And when that happens, then we really must focus in on what Paul has to say here about loving one another, serving one another, being obedient to God, looking at government, and all the different issues that sort of are thrown at us in life. And so this particular text here, I think, just feeds off of the one that Paul was talking about with husbands and wives, and it is closely attached to all the one another passages. I think there's 37 of those in the New Testament. Love one another, consider one another, be kind to one another, and on it goes. So all of that, sort of feeds together here with what we're going to be talking about. We begin with chapter 1, or verse 1 rather, in Ephesians chapter 6. The question in our book, why should children obey their parents?
Right.
It is right, right, in the Lord. What does that mean?
It was his plan.
Yeah, exactly. It was his plan, and it is ordained by God in that sense. So, God approves of that. God, through Paul here, is emphasizing that. So it's just the right thing to do. And one of the things that you notice as we look through these verses is that, that idea it is emphasized again and again. If you'll notice there, he talks about the fact that children obey their parents in the Lord. Well, if you look on down to verse 4, he talks about, fathers not provoking their children, but he uses the expression of the Lord. And then on down in verse 7, as to the Lord. Now your translation may read just a little differently there, but this idea of the Lord and obedience and service to the Lord is all connected together. And Paul makes a very strong point to emphasize the fact that when husbands are loving their wives and willing even to give their own life, that's in obedience to the Lord. When wives submit and show honor to their husbands, that's serving the Lord. When children are obedient to their parents, same principle. When slaves and masters fulfill their duties and responsibilities, all of that was unto the Lord. So, it gets us to thinking about everything that we do. There's been a thought that maybe is not very new, but in the last few years, some have suggested that everything we do is worship to the Lord. And that really isn't true. It's not based on a biblical principle. But it does, I think, suggest here that we need to be conscious of our service to God in everything that we do. Realizing that when we're good children, when we are good parents, when we are good servants, when we are good employers or masters, then God is pleased with that. And in that sense, we're serving Him. And so, He says that this is right. It's what, ought to be done. Now, one of the things, too, I think that this particular passage emphasizes is the principle of parents recognizing the responsibility of teaching their children. And the Bible gives us different examples of what happens when that is not done. Deuteronomy chapter 6, a very familiar passage, I think, along this line. But beginning in verse 4, I just want to read these 3 or 4 verses. Hear, O Lord, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. So, this principle goes all the way back, Old Testament and New Testament, and he truly was emphasizing here the importance of them teaching their children and making sure that the children were taught properly. When he talks about, on your arm and your hands, it is this idea of completeness. The total and complete. The hand would be suggestive of our actions, and the eyes would be suggestive of our attitude. If you go over to Joshua, in Joshua chapter 2 and in verse 10, an interesting passage that talks about the fact that after Joshua and his generation, the people turned away because they did not know the Lord, and they did not know what the Lord had done for them. So what you find there is that when people are taught, particularly children are taught properly, then that they will support that, and we realize there are always exceptions. But if they're not taught, it only takes one generation for the church basically to disappear. And emphasizing that that's exactly what happened in Joshua's day. When Joshua was dead, when those elders, those people were with him, they served the Lord. But then the next generation and the next just moved farther and farther away from God. So, Old Testament, New Testament, the importance of us, teaching and training our children, it is absolutely vital. Anybody with the thought there? Okay, one other thing too, I think the fact that he uses the expression "in the Lord" suggests that he is talking primarily to Christians and those that would abide in Christian homes, rather than those on the outside. Those that are not Christians obviously are not going to teach their children the things that they need to know and need to do. Question number 2. What does Paul say is special about the command to honor father and mother?
That's a promise of long life.
Yeah, okay, we got both of them. Got exactly what the promise is, and the fact, it's a commandment with promise. And if you look back to Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 16, he promised a long life and actually prosperity. Now, I think we have to recognize that is basically a principle. It doesn't mean that just because you are a good and faithful Christian, that you're going to outlive everybody else. Circumstances of all different sorts come into that picture there. But it is a promise and an assurance there that blessings come. And when we are obedient to our parents, when we are good citizens, when we honor the government in those areas where we can do that without violating, God's word, there are blessings that you and I enjoy that other folks, don't enjoy. We can have peace. We can have hope of something better. So it's an interesting thought here of this commandment in reference to what that it entails or what it offers. Now, when he uses the word obey, this is basically the outward response that we are to give to parents. When he uses the expression honor, this has to do with the inward motivation. So all of that is combined there to tell us what type of a character that we ought to have. And when we have this basic understanding of this concept and we practice it in reference particularly to honoring and obeying parents, then we also are pleasing God in that as well. So to obey parents is to obey God. Anybody with a thought there?
Yeah, that you may live long here, that's a part of it. I mean, if you don't learn from your parents the right things to do when you become a rebellious child under the Jewish law, then those children that were so rebellious that parents would bring before the Jewish leaders and had to put to death.
Yeah.
They needed to cast the first stone, but it was part of that really going on here is don't become rebellious, don't do these things.
Yeah, good point. If you're not hearing Urban, the Old Testament passage where if children were truly disobedient and rebellion, parents would take them before the Jewish council, and there was actually the death penalty there. That made an impression, wouldn't it? To see somebody put to death because of their rebellion against parents. But I think it also brings into the fact that without guidance and without respect for parents and honoring of parents, kids get into all sorts of things. You know, today we would think about drugs, we think about alcohol, we would think about, sexual activities outside of marriage, and all of those things that would lead in the abuse aspect to a shorter life and a much riskier life as well. So the emphasis on abuse, and I think too, when you look at this idea of children, he's not just talking about little kids, but he's talking about those of us, at our ages, and I know several of us still have parents that are living there. We must continue that honor. We must continue, that respect for aged parents. So just because we're adults, you think, well, this is, and we, many times when we see this expression of a youth or children in our society, we think of maybe a teenager on down, but they didn't look at it that way. Many times individuals could be as much as 40 years old and still be referenced as a youth or even as a child. So that's interesting, I think, as well.
Christ did that when he hung on the cross. He took care of his mom.
Yeah, good point. That's a real good point. And that's one of those touching scenes, I think, at the cross. His mother was there, along with some of the other women that Jesus had a great influence upon. And he asked John, who is thought to probably be the youngest among the apostles, to care for his mother. Have you ever thought about that in the sense that the brothers of Jesus were still there? But he asked John, not one of his brothers. And there's nothing to indicate that any of his brothers were at the cross. I'll clarify that. But he asked John. Wonder why?
Yeah. John was his closest friend as far as, I think, as far as the apostles goes, and they must have been really, really close.
Yeah, the inner three.
Evidently, there was something there that's not in the Bible about his brothers. They might have been not as we think they were, as far as the mother goes. But I think it goes a little bit further than that.
Yeah, I think you're getting what you say.
Possible something still had to believe.
Yeah, the brothers, they came along later, but they were probably not in that group that was as solid. I mean, that's where Charlie's going to. John was very faithful. He was very dedicated. He was very committed. And from a spiritual standpoint, Jesus may very well have trusted John a lot more than he trusted his physical brothers. Now we know later, James, particularly the book of James, the brother of Jesus. So they were just not as spiritually grounded, I guess.
One more thing in their defense, back then, you didn't become a man until age 30. If I understand the Bible right, and they were all younger than you.
Yeah, Jesus was the oldest. Could be. Jim, start to say something. You forgot what? Since we went on, you forgot where he's at.
But the thought is that, this discussion that's going on there, we don't know how much younger Jesus' brothers were.
Right, yeah, that same point, yeah. Yeah, we know that if Jesus, it's thought that he went to the cross somewhere around the age of 33. So back to Charlie's point, the brothers and the sisters were younger. So that may have had something to do with it. We don't know exactly how old John was either. Again, it's thought that he may have Peter may have been the oldest and John may have been the youngest in that group of apostles, but part of that speculation as well. But it does, I think, indicate the concern that Jesus had for his mother, and he definitely wanted her cared for, and he asked John to do that, every indication there is that John did exactly that. So there was honor, there was respect, there was concern for her, even when he was dying on the cross. And I think that obviously sets us a wonderful example. Okay?
The problem here that, the respect that children have for their parents, if the respect's not between, if they don't respect their parents, then how would they be expected, how would they be expected to respect the government or God?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Respect for God many times is closely attached to respect for the father in the home. And when there is no father in the home, then children really struggle. And many times, kids will get in trouble at school, they get in trouble with the law. So yes, respect for parents begins to build a respect for authority. And if they are taught to respect their parents, much more likely to respect the school teachers, much more likely to respect police officers, government, and so forth and so on. So many things start when kids are kids, 2 years old, 3 years old, 4 years old, when they are taught that you just don't do everything you want to do, and when they are punished in one way or the other, when they are rebellious, when they do things that they should not do. So all of that builds on. So excellent point. Number 3, what should fathers seek to avoid? Yeah, not provoking the children to wrath. What do you think that means? What's he saying there? And how could we mess that up, I guess?
Well, I believe, I corrected my kids. I was real fortunate in mine. I think Scott got one spanking in his life when he was 12 years old. But you don't belittle your children, and if they do mess up and make fun of them and stuff like that, you try to take them aside and talk to them and show them the right way, and just treat them like you love them.
Yeah.
And
But if your son only got one spanking, I should have come live with you. Because it wasn't that way in my house. Oh, how many I got? Yes, Michael?
You're not gonna obey anybody you're mad at. And if you're mad at God, you're not gonna obey Him. If you're mad at your father, you're not gonna obey Him. You're gonna try to rebel as much as possible.
Yeah, it's a good point. When we create that within the child. I think there are different ways, favoritism. When you look at Jacob with Joseph, by favoring, one child gets a spanking, but another child does almost the same thing. They don't get one. That type of thing, by being unfair, by being unreasonable, and we do the opposite of what we intend to do. Children resent that. And I think, as Charlie said there, talking about kids know that you love them, even in discipline. They might not right then, but they'll figure that out. That there's love and there's concern. You discipline them because you do love them, and you realize the danger that's there and the problems that can come up. So parents need to carefully consider their words and their actions. Not to discourage our children by calling them names. They'll get enough of that at school and other places. To consider how we discipline, when we discipline, or do we do it at all in certain circumstances. To realize that when a child needs a hug, rather than a spanking. All of those things, I think, come into that picture. So it's a warning for us as parents to think about how we're going to deal with a child. And you don't want to break a child's spirit. You want to encourage. And I think also it reminds us that the kids are kids. They're going to do things. They're going to forget what the rules are. And they shouldn't be doing everything that we want them to do when they're little. But as they grow and as they develop, then they will have a better understanding of why and what. Anybody else with a thought there?
Well, they're gonna learn, they're gonna live what they learn. Last week we was talking about husband and wives.
Right.
This week we're talking about children. So if our children see how the husband treats the wife, the wife treats the husband, they're gonna live that later on. Here, if with the fathers, you gotta do the battles. And if they learn to, it talks about honor and respect of, that you have to your parents, but same, on the other hand, we have to honor and respect them because they are their own personality, their own person. And if we don't allow them to live it,
Yeah.
then we can't expect them to learn.
I agree. And the kids are different, their personalities are different, and all those types of things, are brought into that. And children have to be taught, and in fact, he's going on here and talk about the training, particularly it's in this verse, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. The training there has to do with repetition. And so he's saying that we're to be consistent. And a lot of the teaching and the training that we give our kids is through the way that a husband and a wife relate to one another. How do young girls know what to look for in a husband? Well, they should be able to have seen in their daddy what a husband really is and the way that he treats women. The young boys should be able to see how their daddy treats mama and also begin to formulate what they want in a mate coming down the road. So I think what we can see in our country today is the fact that a lot of kids don't have a clue about what a daddy really is and how he should act. They don't know about a mother and how a woman ought to be. So it's a ripple effect. And a lot of kids, go into marriage completely unaware of what they're getting themselves into. And a lot of it is because they didn't have those examples in the home. So all of that ties together. Sonny, I think you like Jim, you forget.
Well, probably so right here. All boils down with them leading to the Lord. I look at parents are doing what's right, example we're setting, and then children see it and brought up the Christian-like way. We're all doing what's pleasing to the Lord.
Yeah.
It's what I see in this. We'll all do that. We'll obey our parents, and parents will be good to the children.
Exactly. And everybody makes their own decisions, and Paul is not saying, nor was Moses saying back in Deuteronomy, that it always works that way. These are principles. And a child comes to a point where they must choose. But our responsibility is to make sure that they know the godly side. I know in our family, we have some that don't go to church at all. And they don't go because of maybe a bad experience or they just thought church was boring, whatever. But what they're failing to realize with their young children is that they're not even going to know that side. They're not even going to know that side. The only way that those kids can, know what the decision of the choice is to understand both sides of it. So if it's all worldly and it's all fun and games, then how do they know that there's another side of Sunday school and vacation Bible school and being in worship? So in that sense, parents in some ways are choosing for the kids. And I don't want to stand before God. If I, pointed my children in the wrong direction. So all of that is brought in here. Now, very quickly, as we're almost out of time, number 4, what should characterize the behavior of servants? Verse 5. Yeah, fear, trembling, obedience, and I think you can use this in reference to servants or slaves. The principle would be the same. In BC 30, so we're going back, say, 60 years before the cross, history tells us that there were some 400,000 slaves just in Rome. So there were more slaves than there were free people in many situations. So likely when Paul was writing this, there were Christians who were slaves. And there were masters who had slaves. It's interesting in the dealing with this that you don't have in the Bible a statement made about the sinfulness of slavery or that it ought to be abolished. What you have is Christian principles set forth, such as the Golden Rule, which would get rid of slavery when people actually practiced it. So Paul is talking about servants or slaves being obedient to their masters because that was the way that they could serve the Lord. And masters were to remember that they had a master. Never forget that God is in charge. And as a master or a slave owner or servants within the household, there was a duty and a responsibility there also for them to treat their servants or their slaves properly. And as they would grow in Christ, I have no doubt that many of these masters came to understand that slavery was not pleasing to God, and thus would have freed their slaves and or made situations better. Anybody with a thought there? Okay, it goes on to say, number 5, what should servants avoid doing? And he says, not with eye service or as men pleasers. I would translate that, how do you work when the boss is not watching? Or how does a child act when the parents are not home? Are we only good when we know that somebody's watching? How do we act when we're on vacation and away from our Christian family? How do we act when we're, at a store and nobody we know's there? Are we rude? Are we disrespectful? All of that ties in here, and I think that is at least one of the ideas with that particular question. And question number 6 deals with this idea of masters not threatening, not usurping, authority or using authority that they should not have. And that pretty much takes care of each of those questions. Anybody with a final comment or thought?
We all need to remember, and we're commanded to love one another, and we're all commanded to follow the Lord.
And when we do that, good point, when we do that, it takes care of all these other problems. If we'll just do that, then we'll be careful about what we say, and we'll be careful about what we do. Okay, thank you. Next week, finishing up the last lesson, and we'll talk more about what we do after that.